I'll now turn it over to Drs. Osher and Mayo for the next portion of the webinar.
Okay. Thank you, Michelle. Can I have the next slide? Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Let me just start my timer. Okay, here we go. That people, including myself, have studied the impacts of exclusionary discipline and what we can do about this for at least the last 30 years. And let me quickly distill what we've learned and end up with a very important study that we just completed. First, what can we do to help students? One is, and perhaps most importantly, what we do universally. And among the things that have been identified as being effective is focusing on social emotional learning for students and adults. The provision of positive behavioral supports and interventions, which also includes how adults work together and how they support students. The use of restorative practices and community building activities. Providing ongoing professional and development and support for adults to help support students and help diverse students realize the school's expectations. And the use of policies that limit or prevent suspensions. For example, policies that preclude suspending for subjective offenses as opposed to objective offenses. Next slide, please. This is a multi-tiered model, and most of you understand the multi-tiered model. And what we know about effective early interventions, when we know a child is likely to be at risk, is using warning signs not to punish young people, but to rather to get them the support. Using approaches like functional behavioral assessment to understand what are the circumstances that tend to create and reinforce the behavior that is problematic. The use of alternatives to in-school suspension and out-of-school suspension. For example, in Cleveland, they've effectively used a planning center model that also had been effectively used in Rhode Island and studied. The use of restorative circles to try to help resolve things within schools before things get out of control, and the effective use of coordinated mental health and social support through student support teams. Next slide, please. The universal interventions and the early interventions will be sufficient for some students, but they will not necessarily be sufficient for all students all the time. And therefore, there's a need for a school-wide and community-wide capacity for intensive interventions, which include effective mental health services, include special education, include wraparound supports, include the use of restorative practices. And in terms of the first three, can we go back for a second? Okay, thank you. In terms of the first three, it's important that these services be strength-based, that they be culturally competent and culturally responsive, that they be individualized to build as well as build upon student strengths. And in terms of the restorative justice approaches, they will not work if they're not nested and supported by things like positive behavioral interventions and support and social emotional learning for adults and students. Next slide, please. We also know it doesn't work, reacting rather than preventing, using lectures, telling people what not to do rather than helping them learn to do things. Punishment, there is a consistent empirical body of research that goes back 40 years that shows that punishment does not work. It's ineffective rather than effective in terms of ultimately creating safe conditions in schools. The use of police and school resource officers for school disciplines. You may need police or school resources officers for issues of safety in terms of who's coming in and who's not coming in. But the issue of how a student behaves is not one that is helpfully addressed by employing a school resource officer or a police person. Ignoring the capacity, the readiness of people in the school and the school to implement the practices, whether it's SEL, PBIS, restorative practices, with quality, and the use of suspension. Next slide. Let me just look at the use of suspension to end my presentation. New York City asked me whether or not we had evidence about the dose effect of suspension. Is 1 day of suspension, does it have different effects than 2 days, than 5 days, than 10 days? And we looked at the literature and found out that no one had done anything. And so what we said to New York City was, given the size of the population that they served and the type of data they had, that we could use machine learning to address those questions. And what we did was we examined every student, this is over 1 million students, who was eligible for a suspendable offense. And we matched students on over 80 different variables, including the specificity of the offense that they were accused of. And what we found out when we matched apples to apples is that suspension had a consistent negative effect on middle and high school students' mathematics and ELA credit accumulation. It had a consistent effect on who will graduate from high school. And it had a consistent negative effect on students' future attendance. Not only did suspension of students, as opposed to the matched students who weren't suspended, lead to more suspensions, but when you controlled for the time lost for attendance of those additional suspensions, students also attended last. And let me just end as I pass it on to Rob Mayo, given the study that Dr. Hester provided us. It's important to know that the research on the effects of suspension indicate the fact that suspension affects the ability of young people to have access to higher education and to complete higher education. We know this from statewide studies in places like Florida. And with this, I want to now introduce my colleague, Dr. Robert Mayo, who's done lots of work in districts addressing these issues.
Thank you, David, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a true pleasure to be here today. And there's a lot to build on based on what we've heard with our examples thus far and backed up in the research. Next slide, please. David had one more to go. Well, David, you want to touch on the last slide or you want to keep rolling?
Let's do it for 1 second, 1 minute.
Okay, could you go back to David's last slide, please?
Okay.
Nope, one more.
Yep. Okay. All right. So what do we need to know? And this is just what Rob will now tell you more about, is address adult as well as student needs and capacity, build sensitivity to trauma experiences, prevent problems proactively, constructively address discipline issues when they arise, and combine behavioral, emotional, cognitive, and mental health support. Back to Dr. Mayo.
Thank you, sir. And oftentimes I like beginning these conversations. This is one of the more concise framings, if you will, when we get into these often difficult discussions around student discipline. So everybody take a second to read this. And very much so in line with the whole child approach that we're talking about. And I'd like to share this because it speaks to adult mindsets, particularly not just classroom teachers, but policymakers at the state and local level, and likewise, and perhaps where the rubber hits the road, of course, is the site level decision makers. You know, what are their mindsets when these things come about, and the critical decisions that affect children's future at hand each and every day. Next slide, please. We're going to start.
Hi, everyone. It seems as if we might have a bit of a glitch on Rob's Zoom. We'll try to get him back as soon as possible. I don't know if, David, there was anything further you might want to articulate on some of the things that you shared while we're waiting for Rob's reconnection.
Yeah, I think the most important thing I would add is the fact that what we know is that while interventions like PBIS and SEL can be effective and help address discipline disparities, what we heard from Dr. Flowers is a concern in the state, and I know it's in all of your states, it is really important to center work on equity. You cannot just do the technical things. And I think Dr. Mayo is ready to take over again.
Apologize for that. The technology gremlins ever present. And thanks, David, for segueing back to this. And another thing that we found through a lot of our work is that a lot of disparities take place with the overly subjective or open-ended discipline policies, which are much more susceptible to what we're going to call arbitrary, capricious, and potentially bias-laden office discipline referrals, which often can lead to the disparate administration of more exclusionary consequences for longer lengths of time, no matter the type, level, or pattern of infractions or lack of a pattern of infractions. And even prior to the pandemic and related individual and collective stressors, educator stressors, and we talked a little bit earlier about self-care and the importance of adult SEL and self-care, have a direct bearing on outcomes. And not getting into the weeds too much, but we're trying to set policies up where it can't be a situation where you get on the wrong side of the wrong teacher or catch the discipline decision maker at the wrong time of the day or day of the week, despite the context, despite prior behaviors, despite intention, and potentially end up with suspensions or particularly suspensions of longer lengths. Next slide, please. Another major piece, and this kind of stems from, again, what I call, the parent engagement piece. Far too many discipline policies frame family engagement merely as a notification requirement versus proactively and authentically engaging and collaborating with families and students themselves as authentic solution-finding partners. And the reason we like to include this is oftentimes we'll give a quick quiz at the beginning of these discussions and say, well, how much time do students spend in school annually? 365 days in a year. And we're not going to give you a quiz right now, but a lot of seasoned educators will say 40, 50, 60, 70%. Well, actually, it's around 18 or 20%. And you do the math and circle back later. So that dictates the need not to engage with parents when things pop up, to set up these strong engagement dynamics and collaborative dynamics, period, in a proactive fashion, because if you don't have strong family school engagement and collaboration, you're not going to necessarily find them when these potentially acrimonious issues of discipline come up. So we want to always make that point. And while there are policies that merit a lot of work out there, there's been significant work done in a lot of states and districts that have really revisited and updated their discipline codes of conduct and policies and like to be minimally exclusionary and more supported. Some common characteristics of such reforms include being explicit, be straight up about the position that suspension should be last resorts, not implied, but make that explicit vision, ideal, and charge. A lot of these policies began to place limits on what infractions can and can't lead to suspensions and what are the allowable durations of time. In other words, there's a time, and I've worked in a district or two, where you had, for no matter the level of infraction, could be 1 to 5 days, 5 to 10 days, no matter the child's age. Again, no matter the child's intention, and somewhere along the way, this quick fix or Band-Aid of kicking kids out seemingly became the rule and not the exception, and particularly when it came to students of color and students with special needs. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. Some of the policies have eliminated suspensions and expulsions for younger students altogether. And some of them are pre-K 2, some of them go higher grades. But again, when you do these things, and we'll talk about this a little later, you have to build educators' individual collective capacity to respond to challenging behaviors and support students, which is, as we know, a midterm or long-range game for some of our kids. Some of them implemented, as David mentioned, more supportive alternatives to suspension. There are a lot of ways to bring or reinforce rules and expectations besides kicking them out of school, right? Being clearer through your policies and what social, emotional, behavioral, and mental health supports and services should be available. A lot of times the policies are really de facto family student handbooks as it pertains to discipline. So while a lot of policies are real good with if these things happen, these consequences will happen to you, or shall or may, but then they're very, very light. And if you put your parent hat on what supports are available to my kid who is obviously struggling, I get that, but let's strategize around that. And those things need to be equally as explicit within the policies. And providing clear definitions on the more subjective infractions we keep talking about. And we like to call these the dirty deeds, defiance, disobedience, disruption, and disrespect. And in the Oregon example, we're going to talk about later, like aggression. And what do these things mean? And there's a need to be give examples and non-examples and developmentally appropriate examples for educators to guide their decisions at those critical junctures. Next slide, please. A good example comes from the REL Northwest 2020 study, where Oregon's emergently successful policy reforms included requiring administrators to consider a student's age and past behavior and the circumstances of the discipline incident when assigning suspensions or expulsions, and to use evidence-based approaches to reduce future occurrences. So that speaks to some due diligence that we're talking about around these discipline decisions. And the policy also spoke to limiting the use of out-of-school suspensions or expulsions in grades K through 5 to only those that pose a direct threat to the health and safety of others or were required by federal law. And that gets to the developmentally appropriate piece of it. And we want to avoid these one-size-fits-all policies. You know, how could you possibly have an effective policy that pertains to kids who are 5 to 18? You know, and while the work is hard and it takes time, that is a lofty goal if you're going to really attack this issue and put educators in the position, the students in the position to be successful. Next slide, please. Let's talk about the intersection of discipline and special education. You know, well documented despite the requirements of IDEA as it relates to student discipline, and students' disabilities and those of color are still at most risk of being suspended. And this is even per the most recent OCR data available from 2017, 2018. And at the state level example, and not to pick on Maryland, I'm a proud graduate of Maryland Public Schools, but the recent REL Mid-Atlantic study found that despite a decline in Maryland's discipline rates overall across subgroups, the gap still existed between the decade in question that they studied. And specifically, Black students and students with disabilities continued to be suspended and expelled at more than twice the rate of other students. And this is even true when the same types of infractions were involved. So that gets into potential implicit or explicit biases, and again, we're not just about race and ethnicity. A lot of times it gets into socioeconomic status and the like, and how you perceive certain populations, pockets of your community and the like. But I understand there's a lot of good work still going on in Maryland, and I'm sure that there are hopefully evidencing some positive trends here. Next slide, please. Some prevalent root causes may include the following: poor coordination between special educators and discipline decision makers, lack of adherence to IDEA in general, implementation of it, right? Poor implementation of IEPs and related service delivery, poor coordination of tier supports and special education service delivery. Let's talk about those collectively. In other words, you know, in administrators, little happens as it relates to students with IEPs without conferring with, particularly in this case, the mental health professionals who are directly serving these folks. You know, you don't want to create a situation where there was important information about a particular student, particular groups of students that should have informed, it's my personal time, or should have informed some decision making and been taken into consideration because of a lack of communication, coordination, and collaboration. And the last piece really speaks to some implications for teacher and administrative prep programs. Some of our anecdotal observations have been there's a significant gap between formal training and prep programs and some of the realities in the field. So there's not a lot of talk about multi-tiered systems of support, or enough, around social, emotional, and behavioral supports. And far too often, educators and even administrators making these decisions are not well versed in these things and these emergent initiatives and things in the field. So there's implications there for state education agencies and institutions of higher ed and the prep programs to fill that gap so folks come out better prepared. Next slide, please. Let's talk quickly about this connection between policy and practice and chronic absenteeism. And depending upon how chronic absenteeism is calculated or what those formulas are, and David, I'm going to use an example for our work, our friends in Cleveland. We were simultaneously supporting their what they call Humanware Social Emotional Learning Office, and was more around preventions, interventions, and supports. And at the same time, we were supporting their attendance office. And we started this initiative in a particular year, talking to the attendance point of contact, and they had this long list of students that were chronically absent. And I said, wow, we've been working with you on a while for a very long time. I know the due diligence, the effort you all are putting in these things. I don't believe that your list is that long. So it got to peeling the onion. The point being that I said, humor me, let's remove the kids who are strictly chronically absent because of suspensions. Let's take the kids who are left and look at the kids who, let's say, if the chronically absent threshold is 10 or 11, where half of their absences are due to suspensions. And while that's an important indicator, the kids that remained showed her the kids that were, I'm going to call, good old-fashioned absent or truant due to other issues that we had to strategize around and problem solve around. The other groups of kids, again, you had a pocket of kids that were strictly chronically absent because that counted against their chronic absenteeism rate or the absenteeism rate. So there's a direct connection that was grounded in the, that was reiterated in the study we talked about in David's presentation between kids, your efforts, your discipline policies and practices, and kids getting used to being out of school, kids checking out and not being able to access the support you have available to be able to build those positive relationships, become more productive citizens of their school community and the like. So it's counterintuitive, and it's great that the research backs that up. But there's a need for, really strong coordination as you revisit discipline policies and practices and its effect on chronic absenteeism and family school relationships in general. Thank you. I know I went a little over. Thank you.
No, that's fine. Thank you, David and Rob. Very interesting information that you shared. And I think I speak for everyone. That was very engaging as far as providing the research on school discipline and then the different approaches and even the weaving in the examples from different state and local examples. So we appreciate that information. I just want to continue encouraging folks to share your questions in the chat box. And then also just to foster active participation in general, you can also feel free to share reflections that you might have had on the presentations that you just heard. And then also in light of David and Rob's remarks, if there's approaches and interventions at your district or that your school may be prioritizing, feel free to share those, or even let us know the different successes or even the challenges that you may have encountered in addressing school discipline.